Okay, so let me tie this thread together. At the beginning of the podcast, I talked about Lincoln Gettysburg Address. He uses the word continent in the first line of the Gettysburg Address. That was the first thing I talked about in the last podcast. And then in the podcast I talked about there's this solidarity between the United States and the other democracies in the New World. They were all Spanish-speaking democracies, really for the first and maybe the last time, although hopefully in the future there'll be a solidarity. But anyway, uh, it's the strongest moment of solidarity, I think anyway, between the U.S. And the other democracies in the Americas, which were all Spanish speaking. Okay, so this is what I'm arguing in that, and again, I gave a talk on this in Canada last August, and I have a paper due at the end of June where this is going to be published. That when Lincoln says, our fathers, our forefathers founded on this continent, that when Lincoln uses the word continent, he's not talking about North America alone. He's talking about the Western Hemisphere. So when Lincoln uses the word continent in the first line of the Gettysburg Address, I believe that he's talking about the solidarity that exists between the United States and the Spanish-speaking republics of the New World in the 1860s, especially as Lincoln, after he signs the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, and also because of the French intervention into Mexico. There's a shared opposition among the United States and the Spanish-speaking democracies in the New World about what the French are doing in Mexico. The Spanish-speaking democracies, even more than the United States never really felt like the French would have the power to come north of the Rio Grande or come into the United States. But the Spanish-speaking democracies in the New World, they felt that their freedom was very, very threatened by what the French did in Mexico because it might open the door for the Spanish to come back into the New World. And in fact, during the 1860s, Spain tries to recapture Santo Domingo in the Caribbean and tries to recolonize it. And so, for the Spanish speaking republics of the New World, what the French were doing in Mexico was a huge threat. Again, I said huge, was a major threat because it might open the door for Europe to come back in the Western Hemisphere and try to recapture the territory that it had lost. You know, we look at history and we tend to look at history one way, right? That certain things are inevitable. But from the perspective of the 1860s, remember, Spain especially had only been kicked out of the New World, out of the Western Hemisphere, only 4 decades before. And so the independence of these Spanish-speaking republics, it seemed much more tenuous in the 1860s than it does to us today. Today, it seems like, well, it's inevitable, it's ridiculous to think that the Spanish would have come back into South America. To be honest with you, the French intervention seems really ridiculous as well. I mean, what the hell was Napoleon III thinking that he could capture Mexico? It just seems, really, really crazy. But, he thought he could. He thought the Mexican people would support him. So what you have then is, or what I argue and what I think is true, is that when Lincoln uses the word continent in the Gettysburg Address, he's thinking hemispherically. He's even thinking beyond North America. He's thinking about the entire Western Hemisphere, which again, and it bears repeating, is really the seat of democratic government on a global scale. And so, what Lincoln is talking about at the Gettysburg Address, this idea of continent, that there's this shared concern about monarchical Europe coming back into the Western Hemisphere and trying to reestablish kingships, monarchs, emperors in the Western Hemisphere. Um, and again, let's look at the timing of the Gettysburg Address. It happens, I think it's November 13th, 1863, which is just like 2 weeks after the Union Army enters into South Texas. So Lincoln was very, very much, he very much had Mexico on his mind in November of 1863 when he delivers the Gettysburg Address. And if you don't know what the Gettysburg Address was, is that it was a ceremony that established a cemetery for the Union dead and to a lesser extent the Confederate dead at Gettysburg. It's very, very interesting, and I don't know if I'll have time to get into it in this course or not. But military cemeteries are quite moving. Actually, my father is buried at Fort Sam. They're very, very moving spots, and especially if you go to one, there's of course one at Normandy Beach. Surprisingly, there's one in North Africa because of the North Africa campaign in World War II. And the creation of these military cemeteries is one of the legacies of the Civil War. And one of the first of these military cemeteries was, in fact, at Gettysburg. And so that's why Lincoln was there. That's why he was at Gettysburg. He was dedicating, it was a ceremony dedicating this cemetery at Gettysburg for the Union dead, or at least the beginning of the creation of the cemetery. What was it? It's only July, August, September, October, only 5 months after the actual battle itself. So that's why Lincoln's there. And so what I'm arguing is that what historians have missed in the Gettysburg Address is that they've missed Lincoln, his hemispheric thinking. That we've caught the global nature of his thinking about the Civil War, but he's also very concerned about what's going on in the Western Hemisphere. Especially given the threat to Mexico now that the French army has occupied Mexico City. And I do have in a number of instances where Lincoln, before the Gettysburg Address and after, uses the word continent to signify the entire Western Hemisphere. So what I guess I'm getting at is that in the Gettysburg Address, very, very briefly, Lincoln acknowledges that what you have in the 1860s is a threat between the old world, monarchical Europe, moving into the new world. First of all, with the split of the Confederacy, and then the Confederacy winking at the French as they plan to go into Mexico, and then above all, with the French intervention into Mexico, the capture of Mexico City in 1863, June of 1863, and then a year later, the crowning of Emperor Maximilian as the monarch in Mexico, or really as the emperor. And as I've said many times, from the perspective of 2016, this looks kind of ridiculous. Maximilian seems like kind of a joke, really. But at the time, especially during this period when Lincoln is delivering the Gettysburg Address, the threat to the Western Hemisphere, which, let me just say it one more time, is the center of democracy on the globe, with the United States, Mexico, Peru, Colombia. It's really where democracies exist on the globe. They exist in the Western Hemisphere. And there is this sense of a shared threat between the old world and the new world, between monarchical Europe and the ex-colonies in the New World. Of course, England had controlled what was the United States, and Spain had controlled much of the rest of the continent south of the Rio Grande. So I argue, and I believe that when Lincoln uses the word continent in the 1860s, he is talking about the shared threat to the Western Hemisphere, to democratic government in the Western Hemisphere.